So should I be pronouncing your name? Is it more like Monika instead of Monica?
Monika.
Monika.
It's the official
Monika.
Polish, yes.
Monika.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to, from now on, Monika. Got it. So, little Monika Gomanowska.
Gomachowska. Close.
You were born in Warsaw in
Yes.
Poland.
Yes. Yes, I was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1974. And Warsaw is a capital, so it's in about central, right in the middle, smack in the middle of Poland. And I was born in a borough called Praga, which is sort of a little hoodish neighborhood. And yeah, a little rough around the edges.
What was your life like as a kid in Warsaw? And that was still during the time of communist dominance?
Correct, yes. I left Poland in 1985, and the communist regime, I think, fell in 1988. So it was interesting. It was different. As a child, you didn't realize that there were different sort of, you didn't understand government and you didn't understand politics. But being that, one day in winter we saw tanks roll into Warsaw when the army took over, that was something, to be remembered.
Were you in school or?
Yes, I was in school. I think I was in first or second grade, and they closed the schools down, I think, for a little bit. And, it was, there was protests going on outside. There was demonstrations. There was a lot of, the university had sit-in protests and things like that. So I remember my aunt, since she was going to university at the time, telling me about these things as I was a child. So, but again, because you don't know any different, to you it's just everyday life. Mm-hmm. And it made me who I am, I think, on a certain level. So
How do you mean?
You saw some rough things. Besides for the tanks and things like that, you also have, there was a lot of soldier presence. And, I'm sure people who grew up around different wars and things like that are used to that. But, there was a lot of, even as a child, there was a lot of talk about people being involved in the Communist Party. And there was, the people that we were close to were not, because they were against it, because they were part of the Solidarity movement.
Right.
And so it was just, it was different, I guess, in the bottom line. Mm-hmm. And but again, I wouldn't trade it. Actually, it was kind of interesting. I was raised by a single mother, and my mother came to U.S. when I was 5. The economic situation in Poland was such that, and she just couldn't make any decent money, so she ended up coming here to make some money and leaving me with my grandmother and my aunt.
How did the decision to move come about? Had your family been talking about it for a while? It was understood that you would join your mother at some point?
Yes. Basically, when I was 11, my mother decided that it was sufficient time, I guess. She got married, and she had my brother Barry. So when he was about 2, basically, I think it's just sort of the stars aligned. And one of the things is I had to have a visa to come here, so that took a little bit. And I got a visa. My grandmother got a visa. We got on a Pan Am flight, and we flew to the U.S. And that's when I learned orange juice. First time leaving the country, first time anything.
You knew you were leaving the country for good. I'm going to join Mom.
Yeah, pretty much. So, so I guess, I didn't have that much. It's not like I had heirloom, family things to bring. So I didn't, clothes, a couple of toys, a couple of books, and that's it. So I didn't take much.
How was it saying goodbye to friends and family? Yes.
It was hard, but I knew that, I guess, you sort of like, as a child, you don't think of anything as permanent. It's sort of like, oh, for now. It's like, oh, I'm going here for now, but, I'll be back, or it'll be back. And so it was difficult, but I don't think I realized how difficult it was until I got here. And then with time, you start missing people, you start missing your friends, and you start, because at first it's all this great adventure that you're going on, and you don't know what's happening. And it's just exciting. And basically, it was just a fun ride to do, and that's it. We lived in Astoria.
Astoria,
Yeah.
in Queens.
Queens, yes, Astoria, Queens. We lived a block away from Bryant High School. It was a small apartment, kind of crammed in there, and we lived there for about a year and a half, I think. But it was it was a nice neighborhood. I had it was, again, everything was new, but it was a nice place.
Was there a large Polish population in Astoria?
No, the only reason we lived there is my mother's great aunt was basically from Astoria, so she kind of stayed close to her, but there really wasn't. I don't think we knew, besides for them, I don't think that we knew anybody else Polish living in that neighborhood.
First 48 hours, the first couple of days, how you felt, what was going on in your mind? You're unpacking, you're checking out your new room, going to the store for the first time, on top of being with your mom again. So all these new experiences, and I want to have a vision of that. Tell me what that was like.
That's a very loaded question. Unpacking, I don't recall. I mean, again, you're going way back.
Right.
And again, I've never really traveled anywhere that far, so I think that was sort of the least of it. I think the two biggest parts of that were basically meeting my mother. Because when she left, I was 5, and when I came back, when I met up with her next time, I was 11. So it's 6 years, and it's a big gap, especially at that time in your life. And she was a stranger to me, and I think it sort of followed through for the rest of our lives. That was sort of like that gap always followed us, and there wasn't that connection. So she was just, I was lucky that I had my grandmother, so at least I had somebody that I was familiar with and could be close with. But my mother and I didn't know how to relate to each other. But the funniest is not the word, but the experience I had was actually, as you said, supermarket. Right when we came to U.S., next morning, we went to a supermarket in the story of my grandmother. And to me, it was just, I was in awe because the supermarket was packed with food and meat and cold cuts and everything. And, having just left Poland where everything was rationed out, if they had anything, we had ration cards for things. You had to stand in line, for toilet paper, like silly stuff like that we take for granted. So going into supermarket, my grandmother, I remember, almost cried when she saw the meat counter. So it's sort of like, oh, okay. But for me, it was just, it was overwhelming my senses, the colors, the quantity, the availability. The silliest thing, the first few days, I ate bananas, I drank soda, and I was obsessed with peanut butter. Because I never had peanut butter, so
right.
I was basically sugar high for a while. So
must have been paradise.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was an interesting beginning to a new chapter in my life.
New chapter. What was the hardest thing to get used to when you think back during that time period? And the hardest thing, and I guess the biggest culture shock.
Language.
I
didn't speak the language. So
did your mother or grandmother speak English?
No, my grandmother didn't speak English. My mother's English was pretty basic, very, very minimal, and so she literally signed me up for school. It was a Catholic school, so I went from 4th grade, because we go to school a year later, so I went from 4th and finishing 4th in Poland to 6th in here. She stuck me in the Catholic school, and nobody there spoke Polish, and I didn't speak English, so it was an interesting year. Yeah. But, that was the hardest. The language was the hardest, and then, missing people, missing my aunt, missing my friends.
It started to hit you, right?
Yeah, everything. I basically say I cried for a year,
I want to ask you again about the language and learning. Mm-hmm. So you're in this Catholic school, nobody speaks Polish. How are you understanding and being understood and learning?
Sign language. Feed me, please. No, what happened was, literally, I'm kidding, but it's true. It was a lot of pointing to pictures and a lot of I picked up words quickly. I could understand way before I could speak. So when they would say things to me, I would nod my head, and it was almost like, when people, when kids are hurt and you say doesn't hurt, and they can't say where, but they can shake their head. So sort of that level. I was lucky because they put me, because it was a Catholic school, every lesson they would put me in the back of one of the children, and they would, my fellow, schoolmates, and they would read to me, make me read. So, they were happy because they didn't have to do what they had to do.
Right.
And I was happy because I would get to hear how the word sounded and just sort of, hear it pronounced and repeat and just have that interaction with them.
Mm-hmm.
So literally just, as I said, listening and, PBS and, and I mean, it's true. It's, ironically, I never learned English properly, which might be, showing through very evidently quite now.
After World War II, Poland was largely ethnically homogeneous, like very few minorities for the most part.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Now you're living in New York. You're 11 years old. Vastly different people, different cultures in your school, in your neighborhood, around town. What was that like?
Let's see. So, yes, when I grew up in Poland, 99% of the population was Catholic, 100% white. And so when I came here, I guess, I expected, I've never seen like an Asian person. I've never seen I think I saw like black people maybe in university or somewhere, but again, it wasn't, it was just the magnitude of seeing one person in 11 years and then seeing 100 people in one day.
Right,
so
right.
So it was it was just sort of that I think I expected, because that's sort of like when you watch movies of New York, and you see the cops strolling through the streets, and and you see the trouble kids, these kids, that whatever, you see that. Mm-hmm. So you see shots of the street, so it's a whole it's a melting pot, literally. I mean, I hate to sound so cliche, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
And but ironically, the one thing that I have to say, speaking of how the experience affected me, when I went to the Catholic school, I really didn't have any friends because I couldn't really communicate with anybody.
Right.
And the first person to come up to me and actually attempt on her own to be friendly with me, I hope, I mean I know, but this poor girl, was a black girl. Mm-hmm. And she was, really sweet. And for the life of me, God, I can't remember her name now, which is terrible. But somehow we communicated to such a level that I actually went to a church with her, to a Baptist church, which, coming from Roman Catholic, was enlightening. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, so it's sort of, so that aspect of, would you think it's like, to come from an all-white country to here to be racist, I was like, this was the opposite. I had the first person to approach me was this, lovely girl who, welcomed me, and, and her entire family, took me to this church and dressed all in proper hats and gloves and everything, and I had an experience of my life. So, and then when I look at most of my friends, I mean, a lot of my friends are Polish, but my best friend is, Indian, and I've had Asian friends, and I've had, multitude of everybody. So it's sort of, I think it just makes life more fun.
Yeah, and it just unfolded naturally.
Yeah, it wasn't, I mean, I have, as I said, I have Polish friends, my homies, but, but that's just because also later when I grew up in Brooklyn. So I met that bunch of people.
It's been about 3 or 4 years now. You're a freshman in high school. Did you consider yourself Americanized at this point?
Not yet. I mean, I think freshman year I actually went to 2 different schools. We moved from New York to New Jersey. So I went to High School of Humanities in Manhattan, which was great.
What prompted the move?
My parents bought a house in New Jersey. They decided that they wanted to be, suburbians, and they bought a house. So when I went to the high school in New York, it was great because everybody was from different schools. There wasn't, when I went to schools here, people knew each other from previous schools. When I went to Humanities High School, literally all of us came in, and it was like great because we all started fresh, and it was sort of like the misfits, it's like a group of dorky, nerdy misfits that I totally fit in, and it was great. And then we moved to New Jersey. if you want to speak of culture shock, that's culture shock. So in here, again, when I started high school in New Jersey, these people have gone to school from kindergarten. So they've all known each other. So I come in mid-year almost, right before Thanksgiving, with all these kids who know each other for many, many years. And so it wasn't fun. I was very lucky to have found a friend, and one of my best friends now, who was also sort of, she knew them, but she always felt as an outsider, so the two of us totally clicked, and we kind of pulled each other through. After school activities, I really didn't do much, because my brothers, by now, I had 3 brothers and a sister, and my sister was, I think, about to be born. So I really didn't have much time for anything. I was in the school paper and I think Audio Video Club or something, ironically, and that's it. So it wasn't. It was a just as much as culture shock for me, I think, coming to high school in New Jersey that it was coming from Poland.
Yeah, it's like, oh, here I go again.
Yeah, pretty much. I graduated from there, and then we moved to Arizona. ASU,
okay.
The big party school, ASU. And it was funny because at first they didn't let me in because I applied like last minute, when my parents decided they were going to move again. And but then when we physically got there, I went to the campus and I begged and pleaded and started my persuasive self, and they accepted me, but we just couldn't do it financially. No, I didn't like it at all. I didn't like it. I mean, to be fair, again, it's sort of like I'm thrown into a new environment, and now in this environment, I didn't have, again, I start fresh and don't know anybody.
Monica, my goodness.
Yeah, it's sort of, because I didn't get to go to school, I had nobody. It's not like I had an opportunity to meet anybody. We lived in this like gated community that was all these single family homes, but they were all people my mother's age and little kids. So there was nobody really my age, because kids my age were at school. So I didn't like it. I didn't like the fact that you drive everywhere, and I didn't have a car. I didn't drive.
Right.
I'm not a heat-loving person.
How long were you there?
A little under a year, and then I picked up and moved back here and started working.
And family stayed out there?
My mother stayed out there for a little bit, and then she came back with my brothers because she also couldn't quite handle it.
Okay.
So.
If you had stayed in Poland, what would your life have been like up to this point?
Well, I'll be probably president by now, but I don't know. It's, you never know. I mean, I keep in touch with a lot of friends from elementary school, and a lot of them, they have such a varied paths, that they've taken. I have friends who are very successful, and I have friends who are very, unfortunately, successful. I mean, I would have hoped that I would have hopefully followed the somewhat successful, maybe gone to film school and done something on that if I could have afforded and circumstances would have aligned. The blocks that I had here to overcome, the hurdles that I had to overcome here would have been certain things would have been easier there, but then again, it's, my circumstance and being my family was here, my mother and my stepfather were here, and I wouldn't have, much left in Poland, and again, there's so many different variants that not to give myself a pat on the back, considering that I really didn't have much to begin with. I didn't do that bad. So I think if I would have started off on a better level there, maybe I would have been able to accomplish a little bit more.
Right.
But who knows? Sometimes I feel like if it's the opposite, if you have to fight for things, then you're more likely to succeed versus when they're sort of like, oh, here, go ahead, go to school, and then you get it and you take it for granted. Right.
So, yeah, there's not as strong an appreciation
of exactly the opportunities that you have. Correct.
Do you travel back to Warsaw very often?
Not very often. I have a sister, and I have a nephew, and I have a grandma, and my dad is there, and I have my best friend, and there's an array of people. So I do. Again, with my limited vacation, it's sort of hard.
Right. Well, there's Skype. Do you Skype?
Oh, Skype, yeah. Skype is awesome. Skype is the best invention since the cappuccino maker. Literally just last weekend, I Skyped for like an hour and a half with my best friend, and and it's great because you don't feel like you're losing anything. I've gone to see her, and then I would, we put on Skype and we sit there, and I know exactly where she's sitting, and she's drinking tea, and I'm drinking tea, and we're chatting, and she's showing me, oh, I got this new bookcase, and I can see my godchild grow up, I can see him getting bigger, and, chasing the cat around, and, no, Skype is absolutely, essential in not feeling so much loss as far as,
Right.
I'm not there.
Is that paxi I smell? That delicious donut that's one of the most traditional Polish desserts ever?
Pączki.
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 God, and I rehearsed this earlier. Pączki.
Pączki, yes. Pączki is a traditional Polish, I guess Americans would call it a jelly donut. And yes, it's delish. Traditionally comes with jam that's made out of roses.
Made out of roses?
Like rose jam, yeah. And oh, hello. Okay, come sit. Thank you very much. Sit down.
Oh, that sounds delicious.
Yes, and so they're fried, so they're low fat, and they are original. And there was actually a bakery in Warsaw, which is Mecca for pączki, and it's called Blikle, and it exists since before the war, and. So unfortunately, the ones here are, they suffice, but they're not quite the same. But yes, we shall taste some in a minute.
Oh boy. I'll take a nice shot before we dig in.
Definitely. Well, quickly before we dig in.
Well, listen, this has been so fascinating. I would like to thank you in Polish. I'd like to tell you thank you for allowing me a glimpse into your world. But it's not going to happen. So if you would be so kind as to tell yourself that for me, just look into the camera.
Yes. And what am I saying? Thank you?
Thank you for allowing me a glimpse into your world.
Dziękuję, że mi pozwoliłaś zobaczyć część swojego życia.
Yeah, see, and that's why I was...
I would have to Google that too, just to make sure I translated it. But
Really, thank you so much. This has been great.
You are welcome.
I've loved
This was
it.
great. Thank you.